All right, concluding chapter 9 here, the uniqueness of the Bible. Far from being minor, the divergence of the biblical account and the myth of Oedipus, or whatever other myth, is so great that no great difference could exist. It's the difference between a world where arbitrary violence triumphs without being recognized and a world where the same violence is identified, denounced, and finally forgiven. It's the difference between truth and deception, both of them absolute. Either we succumb to the contagion of the mimetic snowballing effect and fall into the lie of victimization with mythology, or we resist this contagion and rise into the truth of the innocent victim with the Bible. The story of Joseph is a refusal of the religious illusions of paganism. It discloses a universal human truth that is relative neither to the referentiality or non-referentiality of the story, nor to a system of beliefs, nor to a historical period, nor to a language, nor to a cultural context. It is therefore absolute, and yet it is not a quote-unquote religious truth in the strict sense of the term. Does the story of Joseph show partiality to the young Israelite separated from his people, isolated among the Gentiles? Even if one conceded to Nietzsche and Marx that the biblical narratives consistently favor the victims, especially if they are Jewish, it is still not appropriate to place the Bible and the myths on the same level, on the pretext that their contrasting prejudices are equivalent. They are not. The Jewish people, tossed from expulsion to expulsion, are certainly well placed to put the myths in question and to detect in them more quickly than many other peoples the scapegoat phenomenon of which they are often the victims. They demonstrate exceptional discernment in the matter of persecutory crowds and their tendency to close ranks against foreigners, those who are isolated, the crippled, the disabled of all sorts. This advantage, gained at a high price throughout history, does nothing to diminish the universality of the biblical truth, nor does it permit us to take this truth as relative. Neither the resentment that Nietzsche consistently invoked, nor Jewish chauvinism or ethnocentrism could have produced the story of Joseph. The Bible refuses to demonize or deify the victims of violent crowds. The ones really responsible for expulsions are not the victims, but their persecutors, the crowds or mobs caught up in mimetic contagion, such as envious brothers and Egyptians who blindly accept false accusations. We are not foundering in dogmatism, fanaticism, or ethnocentrism if we recognize the kind of truth characteristic of biblical narrative. We demonstrate real objectivity. Not long ago in our society, the word myth was a synonym of lie. Our intelligentsia has done everything it could do since then to rehabilitate the myths at the expense of the Bible, but in ordinary speech, myth continues to mean lie. Ordinary speech is right. All the victims in the Bible do not have as much good fortune as Joseph. They don't always succeed in escaping their persecutors and in turning away persecution to improve their fate. More often than not, they perish. These victims are alone, abandoned by all, encircled by numerous and powerful persecutors, and so their persecutors crush them. The story of Joseph is a happy, quote-unquote, optimistic in that the victim defeats his enemies. Other biblical accounts, on the other hand, seem pessimistic, but that does not keep them from witnessing to the same truth as the Joseph story and opposing the mythical perspective in exactly the same way. What gives the Bible its specific character does not consist in painting reality in cheerful colors and minimizing the power of evil. It consists rather in interpreting with objectivity the mimetic war of all against one, in identifying the role played by mimetic contagion in a world where there are still only myths. In the biblical world, beings are generally just as violent as in the mythic worlds, and the single victim mechanisms abound. What stands against any world of contagion and violence is the Bible itself, the biblical interpretation of these phenomena. What is true of the story of Joseph is also true of the diverse forms used by narrators in many of the Psalms. As far as I know, these texts are the first in human history to allow those who would simply become silent victims in the world of myth to voice their complaint as hysterical crowds besiege them. Human packs pursue them, insult them rudely, set up traps for them, and encircle them in order to lynch them. These victims are not silent. They curse their persecutors loud and long. They express their anguish with an energetic and picturesque forcefulness that scandalizes and irritates crowds more modern than those of the Psalms, particularly those made up of politically correct readers. Our countless professors of compassion deplore the lack of polite speech and these speaker victims use regarding their lynchers. The only violence that scandalizes these professional redresses of wrong is the purely verbal violence of the victim at the point of being lynched. As for the real physical violence of the executioners themselves, our Puritans of violence don't seem to see it, taking it for null and void of meaning. Some other Puritans of violence taught them that only texts are violent. What is essential concerning human violence escapes them. They have completely given themselves over to the anti-realistic school of reading text. Our modern methods of criticism have taken that course. They have suppressed, hidden, or eliminated the referent, which is to say, what the Psalms are really about. These critics, in consternation about, quote, the violence of the Psalms, end quote, are, in my view, completely and totally mistaken. They don't see the most important point. They give no attention to the only violence worthy of being taken seriously, the violence about which the narrators complain. They suspect nothing of the extraordinary originality of the Psalms, which may be the oldest text in human history to let the voice of the victims rather than that of the persecutors be heard. The situation that these Psalms present are just as mythic as the story of Joseph, but they make us think of someone who has the intriguing idea of wearing a magnificent fur inside out, rather than radiating luxury, composure, and sensuality. This one's appearance is just the reverse. We see evidence of animal skinned alive. This metaphor forces us to understand the difference between a myth and a biblical psalm. The book of Job is, in effect, an immense psalm, and its uniqueness lies in the confrontation with two conceptions of God. The pagan conception is that of the crowd, who long venerated Job, but who all at once, by an inexplicable, purely mimetic whim, turned against him. This conception sees the will of God in the crowd's unanimous hostility, just as in its idolatry before. The crowd's hostility is the irrefutable proof that Job is guilty of the most and must confess his guilt. The crowd takes itself for God, and its agents are the three friends it has delegated to him to go to him. Through the friends, the crowd, as it terrorizes the accused, tries to obtain his mimetic assent to the verdict that condemns him, just as in the totalitarian trials of the 20th century that regress to the old paganism, which is its mechanism of unanimous persecution and expulsion in order to resolve contagion turning into violence. Job, as quote-unquote super psalm, shows in an admirable way that the sacred and the crowd are the same thing in mythic cults. This is why the primordial expression of the mythic cult is sacrificial lynching, the Dionysian dismemberment of the victim. What is important in the book of Job is not the murderous conformity of the multitude, but the final audacity of the hero himself, whom we see hesitate at length, vacillate, then finally take hold of the mimetic contagion and defeat it. In doing this, Job not only resists totalitarian contagion, but wrests the deity out of the process of the persecution to envision him as the God of victims, not of persecutors. This is what Job means when he affirms, quote, "As for me, I know that my defender lives," end quote. In all these texts, the ones that in the right are not the executioners as in the myths, but the victims. The victims are innocent, and the executioners are guilty of persecuting innocent victims. The Bible demonstrates a skepticism regarding mimetic violence, one that never before had been able to insinuate itself into a spiritual universe where the massive, irresistible character of mythic illusion protected primitive societies from any destabilizing knowledge. It's not accurate to say that the Bible reestablishes a truth that the myths betrayed. If we did, we would give the impression that this truth was already accessible, at human disposal before the Bible discovered it. No, not at all. Before the Bible, there were only myths. No one and no tradition before the Bible were capable of calling into question the guilt of victims who their communities unanimously condemned. The reversal of the relation of innocence and guilt between victims and executioners is the keystone of biblical inspiration. Let me read that again. The reversal of the relation of innocence and guilt between victims and executioners is the keystone of biblical inspiration. It is not one of those binary polarities, nice and pretty but insignificant, which give great delight to structural anthropologists, the raw and the cooked, the hard and the soft, the sugared and the salted. No, here the most crucial problem is set before us: human relations continually disturbed by mimetic rivalry. Once we apprehend the biblical criticism of mimetic contagion and its results, we can understand the biblical profundity of the Talmudic principle that Emmanuel Levinas often cites, quote, "If everyone is in agreement to condemn someone accused, release him, for he must be innocent, end quote. Unanimity in human groups is rarely a vehicle of truth. More often, it is nothing but a mimetic, tyrannical phenomenon. It resembles unanimous elections in totalitarian countries. In myths, the real reasons that impel the persecutors to deify their victim are concealed. But in the Joseph story, these reasons can be surmised when the 10 brothers come before their victim, who now has an air of royal splendor. When the 10 brothers expelled Joseph, they must have been tempted to demonize him. When they finally recognize him in Egypt, they must be tempted to deify him. He is a living God, after all, like Pharaoh, to whom Joseph is as close as possible. However, the 10 brothers resist the temptation to idolatry. They are Israelites, and so they don't deify human beings. Mythic heroes typically have something rigid and stylized about them. They are first demonized, then deified. Joseph is humanized. The narrator bathes him in a warm luminosity that would be unthinkable in mythology. But this is not basically due to literary talent, for the genius of the text is its renunciation of idolatry. The refusal to deify victims is inseparable from another aspect of the biblical revelation, the most important of all. The deity is no longer victimized. For the first time in human history, the divine and collective violence are separated from one another. The Bible rejects the gods created by sacralized violence. In certain biblical texts, particularly in historical books, there are residues of sacred violence, but these are vestiges without a future. The criticism of collective contagion is a criticism of the mechanism producing the gods. The single victim mechanism is a purely human abomination. That does not mean that the divine disappears or is weakened. What characterizes the biblical tradition, is above all the discovery of a divine reality that no longer belongs to the sphere of the collective idols of violence. The divine reality does not get weaker in separating itself from violence. It acquires more significance than ever in the person of the one God, Yahweh, who encompasses all divinity and does not depend at all on what happens among humankind. This is the God who reproaches humans for their violence and has compassion on their victims. Yahweh substitutes the sacrifice of animals for the firstborn sons, and later objects even to animal sacrifices. The Bible, in revealing the single victim mechanism, enables us to understand the type of world that polytheism projects. It appears superficially more harmonious than other ours because ruptures in the harmony are generally resolved by triggering a single victim mechanism and the emergence of a new God who prevent the victim from appearing as a victim. The indefinite multiplication of primitive and pagan gods looks like an amiable fantasy to many in our time, something created for no serious reason, playful, we might say, or rather ludic, since the word is a la mode. It is a playful fantasy of which an overly serious monotheism, not playful at all, tries to deprive us. In reality, however, the primitive and pagan gods are not playful, they are mournful and destructive. Before placing too much confidence in Nietzsche, our era should have meditated on one of the most sharp and brilliant sayings of Heraclitus, quote, "Dionysus is the same thing as Hades," end quote. Dionysus, in other words, is the same thing as hell, the same thing as Satan, the same thing as death, the same thing as the lynch mob. Dionysus is the destructiveness at the heart of violent contagion. Thanks for listening. Next chapter is the chapter 10, the uniqueness of the Gospels, and then finally the uniqueness of the cross, and then the scapegoat, chapter 12, and the modern concern for victims, chapter 13.